You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's Friday, April 12th. I'm Stephanie Horton.
And I'm Lauren Lantry. A measles outbreak is raising alarm in New York City, but 50 years ago, it was much worse.
Documented 500,000 children had it at the same time. Probably it was more like 1 to 3 million.
When Americans think about the first man in space, this usually comes to mind.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That's the 1969 moon landing. The first man in space was actually Russian, and today is the anniversary of his historic flight.
An exhibit devoted to singer Leonard Cohen opens today in Manhattan, and it highlights a lesser-known part of his identity.
Leonard Cohen was deeply Jewish, and it shows in his work in a way that it doesn't for anybody else.
All that and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Democratic mayors of so-called sanctuary cities agree with the president on one thing. They'd open their arms to unauthorized immigrants looking for a safe place. They're responding to President Trump's threat today to place migrants who enter the U.S. illegally in those very cities where local law enforcement have declined to help enforce immigration federal laws.
We'll give them more people. We can give them a lot. We can give them an unlimited supply. And let's see if they're so happy. They say we have open arms. They're always saying they have open arms. Let's see if they have open arms.
To that, the mayor of Los Angeles said, quote, "These are people, not ponds, Mr. President." The test taker involved in the elaborate college admissions cheating scheme has pleaded guilty to charges of fraud and money laundering. WGBH's Kirk Carapezza was outside the courthouse in Boston.
The brains behind what federal prosecutors have dubbed Operation Varsity Blues was Mark Riddell, a 36-year-old Harvard graduate and prep school administrator. On the stand wearing a black scarf and thick-framed glasses, Riddell pleaded guilty to taking the SAT and ACT for dozens of rich kids or correcting their answers. Announcing the charges last month, U.S. Attorney Andrew Lelling said Riddell is, quote, "just a really smart guy." Riddell has agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Prosecutors are recommending between 33 and 41 months in prison and a fine of $239,000. That's the total amount investigators say Riddell received for his role in the scheme. For NPR News, I'm Kirk Carapezza in Boston.
In Florida, workers doing cleanup at an abandoned reform school have identified sites that may be unmarked graves. NPR's Greg Allen reports researchers have previously unearthed more than 50 graves containing remains of boys who died there.
The Dozier School for Boys on Florida's Panhandle operated for more than a century until it was closed in 2011. Over the decades, a series of investigations found that boys, some as young as 6 and 7, were subjected to sometimes brutal treatment, including severe beatings. After it was shut down, a team led by a forensic anthropologist investigated the site and found the remains of 51 individuals in 55 unmarked graves. Now using ground-penetrating radar, a company cleaning up an underground fuel storage site at the shuttered school has found 27 anomalies, areas that could be more graves. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has asked county officials to work with the company and state agencies to decide what to do next. Greg Allen, NPR News.
It's extremely tough going for flood victims in the Midwest, still waiting for disaster relief. Visiting the Iowa-Nebraska border, Vice President Mike Pence blames the holdup on congressional Democrats.
Call on them to come together and approve a disaster assistance bill for Iowa and Nebraska and do it now.
Several Democratic senators had blocked a multi-billion-dollar relief package, arguing there's still not nearly enough money for Puerto Rico a year and a half after Hurricane Maria. This is NPR News.
From Columbia Radio News, I'm Safira Ahmadi. New details emerged today on the shootings in Paterson, New Jersey. 6 people were shot yesterday, 1 fatally, in 4 separate incidents across the city. A 24-year-old man who was involved in a double shooting on Circle Avenue died, marking Paterson's first homicide of the year. Paterson Mayor Andrew Sayer attributed the violence to warmer temperatures. A family escaped a third-alarm fire in their Jersey City home this morning by climbing out a second-story window. The father and his 3 daughters, aged 4, 6, and 8, made it to safety before firefighters arrived. The cause of the fire is under investigation. New York's measles outbreak continues to spread across the state. Lawmakers and health officials are urging residents across Westchester and Rockland counties to get their vaccinations. Free clinics will be held today in both counties. In Brooklyn, a Yiddish-language newspaper published an editorial condemning anti-vaxxers. Orthodox Jewish communities in the borough have been hit hard by the measles outbreak due to low vaccination rates. The Williamsburg-based paper Der Yid took the rare step of translating the editorial into English. It called people who don't vaccinate their children senseless, heartless, Torah-less, and reckless. We'll have more on the history of measles in New York later in the show. The New York Mets will take on the Atlanta Braves later today at SunTrust Park. The Brooklyn Nets are also back in the NBA playoffs and will be kicking off the tournament tomorrow. On the subway line, strap hangers may experience some delays this afternoon on E, F, M, and R trains in both directions. This follows signal repairs near 36th Street in Queens. It's currently 62 degrees and partially overcast on the Upper West Side. This Saturday may be cloudy, but we'll see highs of 75 and a low of 65. Sunday's high will be around 62 degrees, low around 55 with a chance of showers. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Safira Ahmadi.
This is Uptown Radio, and I'm Lauren Lantry.
And I'm Stephanie Horton. Electronic health records, or EHRs, are the record-keeping system for most American hospitals, and now they're under fire. Congress is holding hearings on how they're so hard to use and even cause fatal medical errors.
But at one hospital in New York City, researchers are trying to work around the flaws. Camille Peterson has more.
Noemi El-Haddad is a computer scientist at Columbia University Medical Center. At her desk, she opens a sample electronic health record for a patient and searches for doctor's notes. On the screen, there's a long list of dates without any information about why a patient came in or what they were treated for.
We see, a list that they keep saying, operative note. Unless you click on each note and read, you wouldn't know what the operation is about or anything like that.
El-Haddad focuses on biomedical informatics. That's the intersection of tech and medicine, and she says this is typical for EHRs. To find something like a patient's treatment history, a doctor has to click on dozens of links and go to lots of different screens.
Physicians and clinicians as a whole are spending sometimes more time dealing with the software than actually interacting with the patient.
That's why El-Haddad built software that organizes all the information buried within EHRs into a single patient narrative. El-Haddad shows me how her program works.
So we have a test patient called Carmen Sandiego. In our test patient here, we have about 5 years worth of data.
The top of the screen is an interactive timeline of doctors' visits and notes. Below that, the software generates a word cloud of the patient's biggest medical issues. So if a doctor wants to look at her history of leukemia, they just click on the word leukemia.
We can actually access the notes that are mentioning this problem, and we can navigate easily to these particular notes.
Thousands of doctors and nurses at New York Presbyterian Hospital are now using El-Haddad's software. She says she gets great feedback on it. Ross Capel is a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania and SUNY Buffalo. He's researched EHRs for nearly 2 decades, and he says this kind of EHR innovation is hard to achieve at most hospitals. That's partly because just a handful of companies controls the EHR industry.
Those companies have tremendous amount of power, and there's not a hell of a lot of alternatives.
Or competition, which means there isn't much incentive for companies to innovate. Also, EHR systems cost a lot of money.
If I buy a toaster and my wife hates it, I'll go blow another $30 and buy another toaster. But if you spend $1 billion or $2 billion, it's not like you can say, golly, there's a better system out there. You are married to the mob.
So hospitals are pretty much stuck with the EHR systems they have. But researchers like Noemi El-Haddad are creating new capabilities for EHRs. Across the hall from El-Haddad, Nicholas Tatanetti uses data from thousands of electronic health records to study medication effects. He trained an algorithm to recognize drugs that cause bad outcomes, like an irregular heartbeat.
And when we show it data for a combination of drugs, it can guess, ooh, this one has patterns that look like a drug that causes arrhythmia.
Using the algorithm, Tatanetti discovered that one type of antibiotic, combined with one type of heartburn medication, causes the dangerous heart condition. But he says because EHRs are hard to use, doctors sometimes don't fill in important data, and that's a problem for researchers.
All of that just means there's less data for us to work with, and so that affects the types of questions that we can answer.
Ross Capel, the sociologist, agrees with the data limitations of EHRs.
EHRs have an ocean of wonderful data that we should be able to utilize. The impediments are terrible because they stop us from jump-starting healthcare dramatically.
Capel says fixing EHRs in hospitals across the country would require big changes to the EHR industry and how it's regulated. Still, Noemi El-Haddad is pitching her software to hospitals beyond New York Presbyterian. She's trying to sell other New York City hospitals on the benefits of revising their EHR systems. Camille Peterson, Columbia Radio News.
This week, health workers also tracked a growing outbreak in New York. The CDC reported 60 new cases of measles in the city. Local officials are desperate to stop the spread.
This isn't the first time New York has fought the virus. Maggie Green explains how we once came close to wiping out measles and why we fell short.
Signs printed on red, orange, and yellow parchment hang on a wall in the Museum of the City of New York. They were printed about 100 years ago, but in big, bold letters, they feature names familiar to us today.
Smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, meningitis,
and measles. Rebecca Jacobs co-curated the exhibit Germ City at the museum. She says these quarantine notices warned people to stay out of buildings where people had these infectious diseases. If someone tried to go into one of these spaces, the city would fine them $25. That's about $650 today.
and people would be forbidden under penalty of law to enter or leave the premises without special permit from the health officer.
For hundreds of years, quarantining the sick was the only way public health officials could handle infectious diseases, like the measles. Jacobs said some people were kept in their homes, some were sent to hospitals, and others were sent to islands, like Staten Island.
It might have been very close to New York City, but it must have felt very far away.
By the mid-20th century, measles in the U.S. was spreading like gangbusters. Stephen S. Morris is an epidemiologist at Columbia, and he says the number of cases grew every year.
A documented 500,000 children had it at the same time. Probably it was more like 1 to 3 million.
Because the measles was so common and so contagious, 10 times more contagious than the flu. Measles viruses can live for up to 2 hours on a contaminated surface, and the microbes are very good at invading a susceptible person's body through the air in a closed space. Moore says, imagine if someone with the measles were to walk into a room full of unvaccinated people.
Probably 90% at least, probably all of them will catch measles with a few minutes of exposure.
It's that fast.
It's very catching.
But here's the thing about the measles. Once someone gets sick, they'll never catch it again. In the 1930s, a researcher named A.W. Hedrick realized as more people in a community got the measles, they became immune, and fewer people in that area got sick. He called this herd immunity. Wan Yang studies how diseases move through populations at the Columbia School of Public Health. She says in order to stop a disease like the measles, not everyone needs to be immune, but you do need vaccines and a magic number.
With a 95% vaccination rate, the majority of them have been immune, so you no longer have continued transmission.
Scientists realized in order to stop the spread of measles, 95% of people would have to be immune. And that became possible with the invention of the measles vaccine in 1963. Luther Terry was the Surgeon General at the time.
As increasing numbers of children are vaccinated, we will be well on the way to eradicating a disease that down through the centuries has killed millions of children and left others impaired.
As the number of vaccinated kids went up, the number of measles cases fell drastically every year until the U.S. reached that magic 95% number in 2000. The World Health Organization said measles had been eradicated from the United States. So why did the measles come back? Epidemiologist Yang says there are 2 reasons. First, as more people move into big cities, that 5% of unvaccinated people becomes a bigger number. Second, in a more crowded space, those people will start to interact more.
And you also have this high population density that is favorable for the transmission of the virus.
Like in New York. But unlike the 1800s and early 1900s, quarantining isn't our only option. We have our magic 95% number if public health officials can convince people to get vaccinated.
Hey, Lauren, did you know tax day is Monday?
Ugh, don't remind me. I filed for my extension this morning.
Well, then you need to listen closely. I sat down with Tax Foundation Senior Policy Analyst Jared Walzak. He gave me some tips for what taxpayers need to consider before filing. Thank you for speaking to me today.
It's good to be with you.
Let's jump right in. Can you briefly explain what is the new federal tax code?
It changes a number of things. It broadens the tax base, so it eliminates some special deductions. It caps some deductions, most notably for the individual filer. What this means is that you're probably getting a tax cut. About 80% of filers across the country are getting a tax cut.
Can you explain the difference between the new federal tax code and the New York State tax code?
The state has conformed to elements of the new law, but they've expressly decoupled from a number of provisions because the state wanted to keep more revenue. Basically, New York used federal tax reform as an opportunity to increase the income tax, but do it without actually raising the rate. So people may not notice when they're looking at the forms or reading the news that there's been an income tax increase in New York, but in fact there has.
So does that affect taxpayers this year?
Slightly more of their income is subject to tax than it used to be, and it's at the same rate without any reductions. So some taxpayers will be paying more to New York than they were previously because there's this sort of unlegislated tax increase.
About half of my friends, I would say, just file extensions. Are there benefits to filing extensions, or is it just kind of putting off the deadline?
Filing for an extension is not an extension in the amount of time you have to pay the tax. It's an amount of time you have to file the returns. So a lot of your tax is already paid. You've had income withheld. And for some people, that might be just about all you've paid. But you are obligated to pay your tax by April 15th. And if you are off by a substantial amount, you will be facing penalties and interest when you finally do file. So pay what you think you owe. You might take that extension to get all the paperwork together, get the details, make sure you get it right, and make whatever adjustment you need to in the coming months. But don't think you can hold off paying anything, because then you could be facing pretty substantial penalties and interest in a few months.
What do you wish people knew about filing their taxes, or what do you see people get wrong when they file their taxes?
Most of your income taxes were already collected from you before you ever looked at a 1040 or went to your tax preparer. And I think a lot of people don't really understand how that works, or at very least they don't have a sense of how much it is. You know, people generally know if they know what their property tax liability is because they get that bill. People often have no idea what they pay in income tax, even though it's a really big tax, because it's been withheld over the course of the year.
What is withholding?
Withholding is when, if you are employed with most companies, you are going to have a portion of your paycheck withheld and directly remitted to the federal government in satisfaction of your income tax liability. So you're incrementally paying your federal income taxes throughout the year.
All right, Jared Walczak, Senior Policy Analyst at the Tax Foundation. Thank you for speaking to me today.
Well, thank you again for having me.
Federal lawmakers are drafting legislation that would grant domestic workers a Bill of Rights, regardless of their immigration status. New York State already has such a law. It was the first to provide protection for domestic workers back in 2010.
But as Sophia Amadi reports from a street corner in Brooklyn, the law is failing to protect some of the workers it aims to serve.
It's 9:30 on a Wednesday morning, and there's roughly 25 Latino women standing on the corner of Macy and Division in Brooklyn. This spot is more colloquially known as La Parada, a place where women wait to be picked up for domestic work, like cleaning houses and construction sites. Some are sitting along the fence, others huddled in groups by the curbside. Gloria Puma is a 35-year-old undocumented worker from Ecuador. She came to the corner 4 years ago when she first arrived in New York. She didn't have to wait long till she was picked up by a woman from the neighborhood.
I had to clean the kitchen tiles on my knees, and she gave me a brush and told me that the lines between the tiles had to be completely white, and they were black, and gave me a very strong liquid bleach.
Puma says back then she only received $11 an hour. Today, the minimum wage in the state of New York is $15. Maria Livia Chusca is 66 years old and is also from Ecuador. She's on this corner almost every day looking for work. Some days she's more successful than others.
Many who come to the corner don't want to pay what's legal. They only want to pay up to 13. They want us to do a good job, but nonetheless, they don't want to pay. It's unfair.
Despite New York's Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, the city's domestic workers continue to face racial discrimination, harassment, and exploitation. That's according to the second annual report on the state of workers' rights in New York City. Lihia Gualpa is one of the co-founders of the Workers' Justice Project, a Brooklyn-based center that works to empower women domestic workers in the community. Gualpa says the domestic workforce, especially here in Brooklyn, is changing. There are more women day labourers like those on this corner who want more control over their schedules in order to care for their families.
And that leads to another level of exploitation, which is workers not working full-time hours actually excludes them from the Bill of Rights.
Under the current bill, workers are entitled to overtime pay if they work more than 40 hours a week, as well as coverage under the New York State human rights law for harassment. But here at the corner, women are seeking day work.
And that leads to a bigger issue, right? Whether the current domestic Bill of Rights has really the power offering the protection that domestic workers really need.
Enforcing the law is also a problem. Laura Huizar is a senior staff attorney at the National Employment Labour Project. She says that undocumented workers are less likely to make an official complaint because of their status.
Because they not only face the possibility of losing their job or perhaps losing some of their wages, they are often threatened with being reported to immigration authorities or to the police.
It's also the fear under an era of Trump.
That's Gualpa again.
With anti-immigrant policies, there is a level of fear about what could happen to me if I decide to stand up for my rights.
According to government data, there are an estimated 240,000 domestic workers in the state. But it's an industry that's hard to measure. A lot of this work is done behind closed doors and in private households.
5 hours.
On another morning back at the corner, 6 women walk past in the space of 20 minutes looking for domestic workers. 2 aren't willing to pay more than $10 an hour. A middle-aged woman arrives and a separate negotiation starts up. Several workers huddle around her. One asks if she's willing to provide a mop to clean with.
Give me mop. Give me mop.
Others ask how much she's willing to pay.
How much? How much you want? 14. 15 is all. 15 is 15.
The middle-aged woman finally nods in agreement. $15 an hour. She walks off, and one of the workers trails behind her. Safira Ahmadi, Columbia Radio News.
When you think of libraries, you might imagine stacks of books, but lately libraries are offering a range of new services.
This means librarians are undertaking jobs they might not have trained for, giving help with taxes, preparation for job interviews, even rescuing drug users who might have overdosed. As Bianca Giacoboni reports, this has caused a loud debate in the librarian community.
There is only one place where a librarian can get this kind of rockstar reception. The Urban Librarian Conference at the main branch of Brooklyn Public Library in a packed auditorium. To be fair, the noisy reception is for Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress. She has joined the conference via Skype, waving from a big screen to remind everyone what an important role librarians play in society.
And someone said, well, Carla, aren't you preaching to the choir? And I said, well, even choirs need to practice.
And one of the issues is whether librarians should practice new tasks such as helping the homeless folks and administering Narcan to overdosing patrons. Many librarians are worried about how to do jobs not in their official job description, in librarian lingo, job creep. Elizabeth Berg is sitting in the audience. She's an art librarian at Pratt Institute in New York and says the job is changing.
Suddenly librarians are in the role of being a social worker.
She thinks that might be a problem. Most librarians have not studied to be social workers.
I mean, I think librarianship needs to evolve and change with the needs of their communities, but I do think particularly for public libraries, a lot of times librarians are asked to fill in roles that they're not necessarily equipped or trained for, and that's just kind of because other governmental institutions are lacking.
One solution could be to hire social workers. The San Francisco Library is already hiring them part-time, and the Central Library in Baltimore will soon be the first to employ a full-time social worker. Christian Zabriskie is the Urban Librarians Conference organizer. He says the librarian has always been a kind of social worker. He likes to call librarians the intellectual first responders of the city, ready for any crisis.
Sometimes maybe that's just getting a John Grisham book. Sometimes that's being homeless and needing housing. Sometimes that's being at a loss as to deal with what your kids or all those questions, all of those ranges of things can come across a librarian's desk in the space of an hour, really.
Either way, there is one thing that many librarians agree with. The budget for New York libraries will be cut by $16 million in fiscal year 2020. And no matter the job description, they need more funding to do their jobs. Bianca Giacobone, Columbia Radio News.
Straddling cultures can be tricky, especially when you're one of a few black kids at your school.
Cynthia Betubiza talks about how she finally found peace in her dual identity as Ugandan and American.
And raised in Uganda. My siblings and I grew up in the D.C. suburbs, a 19-hour plane ride away, in a nearly all-white town with a nearly all-white school. One time, at a St. Patrick's Day assembly, a teacher yelled out, "Raise your hands if you're part Irish." My sister and I were 2 of 4 black kids in the entire school, so you can guess how that went. When we'd learn about slavery and Martin Luther King Jr., my classmates would literally turn their heads and look at me with these sappy, overly sympathetic looks on their faces. Feeling like an alien made it hard for me to be proud of my culture. I was also bratty, to be honest. I thought Uganda was too dusty and that there wasn't enough American food. We spent every other summer in Uganda. I'd always have a good time chasing cows, riding on my uncle's motorcycle in the tropical, hilly countryside, and going to bright, beautiful weddings. Even so, there was always a sense of disconnect because I didn't know any Ugandan languages at all. I have to say, there is so much lost from not communicating with someone in their native language. I got self-conscious talking to them, and they seemed less free. Yes, I inhabit 2 worlds, but I certainly do not inhabit them both equally. People could tell that I was American from a mile away, despite being a carbon copy of my mother. The second I opened my mouth and my annoying American voice rang out, I was truly busted. People would jokingly call my sisters and I Muzungu, which means white person. As I grew up and matured, I started embracing my family's culture, realizing that it added to my Americanness instead of detracting from it. Even still, there were days when I felt American and days when I felt other. Last January, my family and I went to Uganda. My dad was giving us a tour of the family banana farm. As we walked back to the house, my little sister Martha and I shrieked. We had made it back in time to herd the goats. If you haven't spent too much time around goats, especially baby goats, I feel bad for you. Please get on that ASAP. We had never met our cousin Richard before, who was watching over the goats that day. I can only guess he was about 14. Kathy and Henry, our much younger niece and nephew, also came along. None of them could speak English. We took the goats to another hill. As we walked, we were all quiet and awkward. When we finally got to the hill, we let the goats graze in the valley. The sun was almost setting and the view was breathtaking. The kids felt shy around us and we felt shy around them. But Martha had a plan. If we couldn't talk to them, might as well play. Kathy and Henry found a way to teach us a game similar to hide and go seek. I pretended not to see their tiny bodies as they hid behind even tinier trees in the forest, blocking out the sound of their furious giggles. When we got tired, Martha showed them how they looked with dog and bunny Snapchat filters, and they howled in amusement. I had forgotten all about the goats, but before we knew it, they circled back. On the walk home, we were all holding hands. After dinner, Kathy and Henry cuddled with us as we ate melon and sipped passion fruit juice. That was one of the best days of my life. I know who I am. I'm Ugandan American. Now, if you call me Muzungu, I'll just smile and laugh along with you. For Columbia Radio News, Cynthia Betubiza.
To see a photo of that day with the goats, head to uptownradio.org.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
You're You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Lauren Lantry.
And I'm Stephanie Horton.
Coming up, surprise! Broadway shows are catering to our feelings of nostalgia.
And Game of Thrones returns on Sunday. Fans know the show is entertaining, but an expert tells us how it can also be educational.
But first, these headlines.
For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Maggie Green. President Donald Trump said on Twitter this afternoon that he is considering sending illegal immigrants from detention centers to sanctuary cities. In his tweet, he cited Democrats' unwillingness to change immigration laws as a reason for his proposal. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the announcement was, quote, disrespectful of the challenges that we face as a country. Today marks the second day of talks in Mexico for U.S. and Mexican government and business leaders. They are trying to sign a new trade deal that would alleviate delays and taxes at the border they say are hurting tomato, steel, and aluminum exporters on both sides. The talks follow closely behind 2 years of uncertainty after President Donald Trump demanded a renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Officials present at today's talks hope the deal can replace NAFTA. The slowdown started last month after Trump threatened to close the border if Mexico did not stop a surge of asylum seekers. The administration sent several hundred border control agents to handle the migrants, which created staff shortages that caused the delays. Today, Sudan's military council promised a new civilian-led government. The announcement comes a day after the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir. Bashir seized power in a military coup in 1989, but in recent months faced demonstrations sparked by rising food costs and high unemployment. He was arrested yesterday after 3 decades of autocratic rule. Star Wars fans got their first peek at the saga's final chapter today at a Star Wars convention in Chicago. Mark Hamill, who played Luke Skywalker throughout the saga, voices the new trailer.
No one's ever really gone.
Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, is slated to hit theaters on December 20th. U.S. stocks rose today, bringing the S&P 500 above 2,900 for the first time since early October. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 251 points, and the NASDAQ Composite added 33.64 points. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Maggie Green.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Lauren Lantry.
And I'm Stephanie Horton. Leonard Cohen, who passed away in 2016, was a man of many talents: singer, songwriter, poet.
A new art exhibit opened this week, dedicated to Leonard Cohen and his ongoing spiritual quest. Maddie Foley has more.
As soon as the museum opened its doors this morning, a human traffic jam formed, drawn into a room dominated by 3 huge video screens and filled with beanbag chairs.
But he gave me permission to find a voice, to locate a voice, that is, to locate...
It's George Fox Passing Through, a 55-minute loop of Cohen's biggest hits, one of 13 different pieces by artists responding to his work. Ruth Bish is the Jewish Museum's program director.
This is not, an exhibition of memorabilia. It is a series of installations by these really brilliant artists who have, in their own way, interpreted and are presenting Leonard's practice.
The Leonard Cohen Show is called A Crack in Everything. It debuted in Montreal this year. In another room of the exhibit is the installation Depression Chamber. Visitors take turns lying on their back on a platform. Animated religious symbols float across the ceiling in time to Cohen's song, Famous Blue Raincoat.
She was nobody's wife. Well, I see you there with...
Bish says that it makes sense that it would open in New York, at one of the country's oldest Jewish spaces.
Leonard is obviously a great cultural icon and also a Jewish icon. So it's part of his identity. It's baked into his DNA.
Julie Kesmer is a religion reporter for The Washington Post. She says a particular spiritual sensibility runs through much of Cohen's work.
Leonard Cohen was deeply Jewish, and it shows in his work in a way that it doesn't for anybody else.
Many of the show's pieces encourage visitors to actively engage with Cohen's voice. The Poetry Machine is an installation by Janet Cardiff and George Burr Miller. Program Director Ruth Bish.
In which visitors are invited to come up to a Wurlitzer organ and press a key. And when they do, they hear Leonard, in his own voice, reciting poems from his amazing volume, The Book of Longing.
Page 191, The Great
If you press more than one key at a time, you start to hear Leonard's voice in duplicate, and sometimes somebody really presses a lot of keys, you get this cacophony of his voice.
And he drives significantly too fast before sympathy for forgiving after. I don't know how it's going to end. You always left that open.
Nearby is a dimly lit wood-paneled room. A recording plays a chorus of voices, all humming one of Cohen's most recognizable compositions, Hallelujah. The song is being streamed live on the internet. The number of voices reflects the number of listeners worldwide. Visitors hum along to this global community. And it's this ability of Cohen's music to inspire a communal experience. That's what visitor Charles Leiter likes best about his creative icon.
I like the profound appreciation he had for human emotion.
A Crack in Everything will be at the Jewish Museum until September 8th. Maddie Foley, Uptown Radio.
A new show on Broadway is based on a popular movie from 1982. Tootsie is just one of many recent film-to-stage adaptations, all hoping to draw audiences by tugging on their memories. My co-host, Stephanie Horton, reports on the commercial value of nostalgia on Broadway today.
Chrissy Barrere is so excited she doesn't even notice the long line forming outside the Niederlander Theater on Broadway. She reaches for the brass doors just before being ushered out to wait in line. The show she can't wait to see? Pretty Woman.
Well, sadly, it's a staple of my childhood. This is one of the movies I grew up watching. So I think if anything, it's something that signifies my childhood and growing up.
The line is stretching halfway down the block. Helen Drum is standing at the front. She's from Ireland. Drum can hardly contain her smile while speaking about star of the film and super hunk Richard Gere.
I think Richard Gere's in a class of his own. I think every woman has an idol, and Richard Gere happens to be one of mine.
Just to be clear, Richard Gere isn't in the Broadway production, so Drum plans on getting inventive.
I'll just use my imagination.
Imagination fueled by nostalgia. Pretty Woman, Tootsie, Beetlejuice, Frozen, and Mean Girls are all film-to-stage adaptations playing on nostalgia to draw crowds who remember these movies and love them. Jimmy McNicholas is with Spotco, the marketing company handling Pretty Woman, the musical.
Nostalgia for something that you love is a precious and personal thing for a consumer. And so we want to respect that and engage that, but at the same time, we need to be clear about what the show is and what the show is going to deliver. It's not the movie, right? It's the musical.
I look around and what I see is I don't belong here. This isn't me.
The film Pretty Woman was made almost 30 years ago. It told the story of a prostitute named Vivian picked up one night in LA by a lonely, wealthy businessman. They fell in love and lived happily ever after.
It's not what I wanted. This is not my world.
Big musical numbers set to well-known movie scenes play on people's fond memories. Bjorn Schirmer is a professor and nostalgia scholar at the University of Oslo. He says setting these memories to music helps awaken happy feelings.
There's no doubt that the medium, as emotional as the musical, is probably one of the most nostalgic, enhancing medias that we have. That's what musicals do, basically.
Well, that's certainly what the producers of Pretty Woman, the musical, are hoping. Just listen to the music and lyrics they added to the movie's iconic scene when Vivian goes on a shopping spree and finally starts to feel beautiful.
It's time to show them who you are, and no one's gonna stop you.
Schirmer says we can't go back in time, but nostalgic musicals sell tickets because they let us imagine we can.
That's in fact what enhances or empowers the very nostalgic feeling. That is that you know At the same time as you enjoy kind of like this past universe, you know that it doesn't exist anymore.
Pretty Woman the musical has received overwhelmingly negative reviews. Deadline called the stage adaptation a cloying, regressive Broadway musical, and the New York Times called it shop-worn. Despite those reviews, it has run for over a year. Jack Viertel is with Juja Mason Theaters, currently running Mean Girls, Frozen, and The Book of Mormon. He says shows with familiar names have serious selling power.
If you have something that has a famous title, you have a way to sell some tickets. And Broadway's a business. It's an art form that's a business. Sometimes it's just a business, and sometimes it's just an art form that's not a very good business.
He says adapting pre-existing material like books or movies comes with other advantages.
Finding someone who can write a completely original musical and make it work is not so easy to do. Finding a story that already works and figuring out how to adapt it is somewhat easier to do.
Viertel says that even the legendary Rodgers and Hammerstein adapted, giving us Oklahoma, The King and I, and The Sound of Music. The next nostalgic production to hit Broadway? Moulin Rouge. It starts previews in June. Stephanie Horton, Columbia Radio News.
The sidewalk doesn't suit my soul. I've gotta make some changes and take control. I need room to move. I wanna feel the wind in my head.
The summer before Hannah Critchfield left for college in Chicago, she was preparing to say goodbye to driving and to Meijer supermarkets, and also to someone very special.
My grandma and I were the same age, at least according to her. Stage 2 of Alzheimer's looks different for everyone, and for Grandma Carolyn, it almost seemed like she was moving backwards. She talked about wanting to call her husband, dead for 10 years, and then all the boys she was meeting in college. I was her driver that summer, taking my grandmother out once a day, for lunch, for grocery shopping, for walks around the windowless mall. It was my way of saying goodbye to a woman I knew would be less and less like herself each time I returned to visit. It was jarring to see how much Carolyn was changing. My grandmother was a brilliant and hard woman. She worked in state politics and brought electronic voting to Charleston. She met 4 presidents. But this grandmother, the one in my car, she hugs and coos at babies. New Carolyn and I drive, talking a little and listening to Simon and Garfunkel's greatest hits. I far prefer it to her other choices, Ultimate Country Party 1 and 2. I watch her watch the flat cornland pass and wonder if she remembers anything about the Green Mountains of West Virginia, if she thought it greedy to see so much sky in one frame. The drives are mostly awkward and unspectacular, not the driving Miss Daisy parallel I'd created in my head. We run through the usual chit-chat, then I ask if she needs anything at the store before we go home. One day she answers yes. She sounds like the old Carolyn. It was like I'd asked if she wanted a stiff drink or enjoyed the latest David McCullough biography. Well, okay then, I say. What do you want to buy? She furrows her bird-like brows. It plugs your pores. Deodorant? No, that's not it. I drive to Meijer's grocery store, trying to decipher what my grandmother means. When we get to the hygiene aisle, she finally exclaims, "Oh, I know, antiperspirant." Carolyn, what's the difference between deodorant and antiperspirant? Well, antiperspirant doesn't have a smell, she says. That way, when the boys are feeling you up, they don't come home smelling like you to their mothers, she leans in. Or their girlfriends. History did a backbend that summer, without asking my grandmother's permission. It also gave me some of her secrets. She was the grandma who bought me books, not toys or clothes, every time she came to visit. The grandma who had a patent to her name for inventing a new type of plastic. But she was also the grandmother who had made out with other people's boyfriends. The year Carolyn died, my college boyfriend cheated on me with one of my good friends. And I thought, was this my fault? I had laughed when my grandmother had told her story. Was this some kind of Stanley Yelnats-esque karma? But then I remembered how that moment had felt. I saw how a situation that was likely not funny for those involved at the time could become a gift decades later. A break in the granddaughter-grandmother code that was so outlandish you had to laugh rather than cry. Sometimes the only difference between everything being beautiful and everything hurting is time. And I like to think both old and new Carolyn would drink to that. Hannah Critchfield, Columbia Radio News.
And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus loves you more than you will know.
This Sunday is a big night on television. Game of Thrones returns for its final season. So last night, I talked with Bruce Craven, a professor at Columbia Business School. Craven teaches a class where students explore leadership and management through works of fiction. He's also the author of Win or Die: Leadership Secrets from Game of Thrones. We talked about lessons New Yorkers can learn from the show, and how the series is actually pretty similar to New York itself. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, Lauren.
I'm so curious, how did you come up with this idea to write Win or Die?
Here's what happened. I had been teaching my course at Columbia Business School. I introduced it to my MBA class. I put up the PowerPoint with all the characters' faces and the title Game of Thrones, and the room just exploded in applause. I remember I went outside after the class and I called my wife and I said, "Oh my God, I got to write this book."
Yeah, so for our listeners who don't watch, can you describe Game of Thrones in 30 seconds?
Sure, it's an epic drama. It's set in this mythical land based on the War of the Roses in the 1400s. It's very Shakespearean. There's these different leaders who are from these different city-states. They're competing against each other and attempting to gain control of what's called the Iron Throne.
When Season 7 aired, it aired in 186 countries. In the U.S. alone, there were more than 300 million viewers. Why have people become so into this show?
So you can identify with any number of different characters. I think we see something of ourselves in all of them. You also will see that certain people you think are heroic make really tragic mistakes. People that you think are evil overcome some character issues and become, to a degree, heroic. The female characters go through a lot of hard times in the first couple seasons, and they step into significant leadership roles.
What leadership lessons can New Yorkers gain from watching Game of Thrones?
In Game of Thrones, the characters are dropped into this very intense environment, and the ones that survive, they enter that environment by focusing on learning and by engaging with that environment and engaging with the people around them. New York City is that same kind of place. It's intense. It's on the go all the time. People are pursuing what they care about, what motivates them, what their aspirations are. And you need to approach New York in the same way that the successful characters approach Game of Thrones. If you go into New York City and you start walking around judging people on superficial, immediate interpretations of whatever they might be doing, you are foolishly closing the door on so many opportunities.
What character do you think would make it in New York?
The two people that come to mind immediately to me are two of my favorite characters. Lord Varys had a very hard childhood. He's had a hard life. But he's very motivated by delivering good results for a large group of people. The other person is Ser Davos. You see Ser Davos, who really, grew up kind of as a criminal, but he has a very good heart, and he's trying to lead people to make the right leadership decisions. And they would achieve good ends. And part of that is because they have experience at all different levels of society.
One thing to push back, because everybody knows in Game of Thrones, all of the main characters basically die. There's just blood and gore. There's these awful things that happen to people. Should we really be learning from Game of Thrones?
Yes, at times it's horrifying. It also is offering sort of guidance and encouragement to go approach your own life with courage and with care for others and with aspiration.
So, Bruce Craven, thank you so much for coming on to Uptown Radio and speaking with us.
Lauren, it's been my pleasure, and excited about Sunday, too.
May your favorite character not die.
And the same to you.
And now from fantasy to what a century ago was pure science fiction, man's travel into space.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In case you don't remember, that's Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. But Armstrong wasn't the first famous spaceman. Rebecca Ward has more.
In 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin did something no human being had ever done.
What he did, he was the first man sent to cosmos, according to official history, yeah. But actually he was the first one who was sent there and who returned back successfully. So he was not for so long there in the space, but it was a unbelievable, really unbelievable event in our history. In history of our life.
That was Regina Kadekel, founder of the Russian-American Cultural Center in New York City. In Russia, Gagarin is a big deal, as is April 12th, today, the anniversary of the first manned mission to outer space. I caught up with 2 Russian-American electricians over morning coffee in New York's Brighton Beach. They tell me everyone in Russia celebrates April 12th. It's called Cosmonautics Day.
День космонавтики. Day Cosmonaut.
Yeah. But it's an official celebration in Russia.
Even though New York City is home to the largest Russian and Russian-speaking population in the Western Hemisphere, Yuri's achievement isn't really on our radar.
Because it's a different story and different memory in different countries.
Yeah.
Kim Binstead studies human space exploration at the University of Hawaii. She says there's a reason why we know Neil better than Yuri.
Well, at the time of the flight, of course, the U.S. and Russia, then the USSR, were adversaries, shall we say. And the space race was a big deal. It was a competition. So I think that people at the time were sort of less keen to celebrate the achievements of our competitor.
Binstead said, these days the space community is happier to acknowledge all of humankind's space wins. Take Catherine Coleman, an American astronaut who says she looks up to Gagarin.
I was part of Expedition 26 for the space station, and we actually launched from the exact same launch pad that Yuri Gagarin did. And when I first got selected as an astronaut, you think about all the people that have gone before you and what each of them brings, and Yuri in particular, because he was the first. For me, it was always a reference. I wonder what this was like for Yuri.
Coleman had a chance to celebrate that wonder from the stars. She was on the International Space Station on the day of the 50th anniversary of Yuri's first flight. Coleman played a flute duet with Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull was in Russia. Coleman played from space.
Well, being up on the station, it's really clear that, even though we're in space and everyone else is on Earth, we're actually really just so connected. It meant a lot to me to be able to just show off that this, space and Earth, they belong to all of us.
And that understanding is just one small step. Reporting from Earth, Rebecca Ward, Columbia Radio News.
We end our show today with another personal commentary from our series. The strongest bonds between family members often grow from ongoing, lifelong conversations. Alex Coletta recalls how his conversations with his father changed forever.
That's my dad. He's behind the camera filming me as a baby. I'm crawling on the floor, chasing after a red balloon.
Get that balloon. Uh-oh. Where'd it go? Where's the balloon? Alex, where's the balloon? There's a balloon.
I watch this video every couple of years to hear his voice. Sometimes I hear it in my dreams.
Hey, Alex.
Just a few years after he shot this video, my dad got diagnosed with tongue cancer. The doctors said he had a slim chance of survival, and the kind of care he needed was so expensive my mom joined the military for their health benefits. She did tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. My father went into remission, but the cancer came back. When I was 16, the doctor said they'd have to remove his tongue. Years earlier, he told my uncle he'd rather die than lose his tongue, but when he was confronted with it, he had to do it. The night before the surgery, our whole family came together for his last supper. My dad ate his favorite dessert, ice cream. But I don't remember any of this. I don't even remember going to the hospital the next day. But my aunt tells me that I was there, and I was scared. From that point on, everything he said to me was written. The first conversation we had after the surgery went smoothly. He wrote on a whiteboard with a dry erase marker, clearing each sentence with a pink cloth before starting the next. He smiled often, cracking jokes when he could, letting me know that it was still him. He looked the same. If you saw him on the street, you wouldn't think anything was wrong with him. He just couldn't speak anymore. My dad would still wake me up in the mornings. He'd shake me and scribble a note for me on his pad, but my vision was poor. I'd have to put in my contacts before I understood what he was saying. Those last couple years of high school, I felt distant from my friends. No one else had a mute parent. It seemed like the worst thing that could ever happen. Thinking back on those years, I called my Uncle Bill and asked what it was like to see his older brother suffer.
I can't imagine not being able to taste food, eat, and talk. It would be so hard. I mean, at this point in my life, and I'm not in that situation, I don't think I would do that. I don't think I would get that surgery.
I don't think I would either.
Yeah.
My father lived another 9 years. He passed away at 60. This month, I turned 30. With his luck, my life is half over. I try not to think about it, but I probably always will. Sometimes I'm reluctant to tell women I date about what happened to my father. Maybe they'll think it could happen to me. After worrying for a few years, I finally went to see a doctor. He checked my mouth and told me I was all clear. He also told me that type of cancer isn't hereditary. It's been 5 years since my father died. Sometimes I still hear his voice in my head. But here's the thing about conversations written down. You don't remember texts that you read on a paper 10 years ago. Not like someone's voice. I don't really remember most of the written conversations we had. Only the mood or tone. But I do remember the sound of his voice. And I hope I always will.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye, Alex.
Alex Coletta, Columbia Radio News.
Well, that does it for this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer today was Andrea Salcedo. Leading our staff of reporters was senior producer Sachi McClendon.
Director Shannon Lynn coordinated our studio production with Hannah Critchfield and Moira Warburton.
Our web team Camille Peterson got this stream live to the web. Sophia Amati and Maggie Green produced the news. Senior editor Ali Swenson and assistant editor Alex Coletta led our copy team.
Our instructors, Joanne Farian, Sally Herships, and Ben Shapiro advised our staff, along with Acacia O'Connor. I'm Lauren Lantry.
And I'm Stephanie Horton. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.